Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Um, my name is Elliott Drago. Thank you all for joining us today. Today, we're going to discuss the long road to Juneteenth. I'm Elliott Drago, resident historian and manager of network engagement at the Jack Miller Center, an organization committed to education and the principles of the American founding and their place in our history. With our partners, we at JMC seek to strengthen this foundational civic education in three important ways. We support and empower a growing network of professors who teach the American political tradition. We leverage that network for the benefit of K-12 civics and history teachers. And we convene leaders, practitioners, and funders to build a diverse coalition committed to a true renaissance of civic education in this country. You can learn more about all of that we're up to on our website, jackmillercenter.org, and I encourage you to check it out. But here today, we are going to talk about the long road to Juneteenth. As the oldest nationally recognized holiday commemorating emancipation, Juneteenth reflects America's long and often difficult pursuit of its founding ideals: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet how well do we as Americans understand the Civil War roots and historical origins of this day? Some of the questions we'll ask include, who were some of these slave traders? How did the slave trade function during the war? What effects did the slave trade have on major Southern cities? How did Black Americans resist the slave trade during the war? And how did their efforts impact the overall Confederate war effort? We're also going to take a look at a couple of primary sources that will help us contextualize the end of the slave trade and the fraught realities Black Americans faced after the war. Joining us today to discuss these questions and more is Professor Robert K.D. Colby, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Mississippi. His award-winning book, An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South, explores the survival of the domestic slave trade during the Civil War, using wartime slave commerce to examine the endurance of Confederate nationalism, economic and social life during the war, and the contested onset of African-American freedom. Dr. Colby has published in the Journal of the Civil War Era, the Journal of the Early Republic, and Slavery and Abolition, as well as an edited volume on reconciliation following the Civil War. Robert Colby is also the recipient of the Society of American Historians Allen Nevins Prize, of the Society of the Civil War Historians Anne J. Bailey Prize, and Anthony K. Memorial Essay Award, and was a finalist for the Southern Historical Association C. Van Woodward Award. Before joining the University of Mississippi's History Department in 2022, he was a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for American Studies at Christopher Newport University. Dr. Colby holds a PhD and MA in history from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a BA in history from the University of Virginia. The format of our meeting today is 30 minutes of interview-style conversation and about 15 minutes of Q&A. We're going to open up questions at the end of our talk, so please have them ready to drop in the public chat. Thank you again, Robert, for taking your time out of your day to meet with us. Is there anything you'd like to say before we get started?
Oh, no, just that I'm excited to be here and talk with you this afternoon.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we're delighted to have you. So my first question is, what drew you to study the domestic slave trade?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of two things. One is sort of pragmatism, and one is rooted in sort of the larger questions that had always got me interested in history in the first place. I grew up in a family that cared a lot about history. I grew up in Northern Virginia, where history is sort of palpably around you, walking battlefields, visiting historic sites, museums, things like that. And as someone who sort of aware of and generally interested in American history from the very beginning, I knew and was sort of aware of slavery as this deep contradiction to what I understood to be the American story, or the American story that I was taught or I saw portrayed in so many places. And so as I advanced in my education and as I entered the graduate program at UNC, I knew I wanted to work on something about the history of American slavery, and particularly in the Civil War era. And that sort of dovetailed with the sort of academic interest that existed when I was in graduate school. There was a lot of really great work being done on the slave trade. It was something historians had sort of rediscovered in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And people were doing really great work unpacking what this traffic in humanity looked like. How exactly was it that slaveholders and slave traders moved almost 1 million people from one portion of the South to another in the decades leading up to the Civil War. What did this mean for the economy of the Old South, as well as for, and especially for, the people caught up in this traffic? And so, these interests sort of came together. And particularly, I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to work on, what I wanted to write about, but I was reading Civil War correspondence. I was reading Civil War letters and diaries, just sort of hoping something would inspire me. And one of the things that struck me was that in these Civil War letters, in these diaries, in these newspapers, I kept seeing references to um, people being bought and sold. And I would just say this struck me as odd, because if we know one thing about the Civil War, we know that the Civil War spelled the end for American slavery. And yet, here, deep into the Civil War, I kept coming across references to efforts to purchase, sell, or otherwise transact in people. And so that really drew me into the study that ultimately became my book.
Excellent. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about your book. Can you explain the central thesis of an unholy traffic, slave trading in the Civil War South?
Yeah, sure. Well, to put it pretty simply, the first thesis is simply factual, right? Which is that the slave trade continued deep into the Civil War. In fact, all the way to the very end of the Civil War. And to push beyond that, what I argue is that this mattered intensely for not only the ways in which people understood the Civil War, but also for the ways that they experienced it. And I mean that particularly for Southerners, both white and black. Confederates used the Civil War in a number of ways during the Civil War, whether that's to sort of hold at bay some of the challenges that the war presented for them, shortages of food, labor needs, things like this. But it also provided them with a means of confronting both the immediate realities of the war, sort of doing some economic hedging during the conflict,
Hmm.
but also buying a form of property that they thought would appreciate, that they thought would be incredibly valuable when they won their independence and achieved the goals for which the Confederacy had been set into motion. Um, at the same time, it also provided Confederates with a means of confronting emancipation, and for African Americans, presented a major obstacle on the road to the freedom that the Civil War ultimately produced.
Wow. Wow, it's powerful. So, you know, um, some of the main actors in your book are slave traders, right? And you open your book
Mhm.
with a harrowing story of Robert Lumpkin and his attempt to smuggle 50 enslaved people out of Richmond, Virginia. So, who was Lumpkin? And you note this at the end of, I believe, the first chapter or your introduction. You say that Lumpkin's story, or this story in general, serves as a microcosm of the Civil War.
Yeah, so Robert Lumpkin was a Richmond slave trader and slave jailer. He had joined the slave trade. He'd begun buying and selling people as a relatively young man in the 1830s, and had done so for close to and made this his business for close to 2 decades. By the late 1840s, early 1850s, he has sort of transitioned his business, and his main activity is he runs what we sort of colloquially what I call sort of as a shorthand a slave jail, but what is functionally sort of a slave trading center. He has a
Hmm.
jail where he holds people whom others are trying to buy or to sell, where someone who's moving enslaved people from the upper South to the lower South might essentially stash them for a certain amount of time, where runaway slaves, fugitives from slavery, can be held until someone can reclaim them. Um, and alongside that, he has a hotel where people can stay as they're engaging in the slave trade. He has sort of all of the things. He has a kitchen. He has kitchens for feeding these people. So it's really a slave trading complex that includes a
Right.
jail, a hotel, and many other things. He's deeply enmeshed in the business of slavery. And I began the book with him, and I end the book with him as well, because this story, this story that Robert Lumpkin tried to move 50 people that out of his jail, out of Richmond, even as the city is falling, is one that isn't exactly unknown, right? It shows up a lot in books
Hmm.
on Richmond, especially during the Civil War, but sort of as a footnote or as a nice little anecdote of like that the Civil War is bringing freedom. And what
Hmm.
no one had really sort of thought about is, well, why did he think this was worth the trouble, right? If Richmond
Right.
is falling, what does Robert Lumpkin think he can accomplish by moving 50 people further south? And that's sort of what's at the crux of my book is that he's doing what people had been doing throughout the Civil War, that
Hmm.
he's trying to hold on to, maintain investment in enslaved people. He may also be sort of trying to insulate himself against like liability claims by the people who
Hmm.
by enslavers who had stashed people in his jail. But he's essentially trying to kind of uphold or maintain or keep going a little longer this world that's built on slavery. And it's in that way that I think that he's a really nice, really pure encapsulation in many ways of what the Confederacy is about, what the Civil War is fundamentally about. It's a struggle to keep, on the part of the Confederacy at least, to keep that world intact and to perpetuate it.
So, in talking about Lumpkin and his slave jail and the slave trading network, how would could you describe maybe the conditions that enslaved people endured inside these buildings, and how do we know about the conditions? How, what primary sources did you consult
Mhm.
to find out what the conditions were like inside this slave trading network from the enslaved's perspective?
Yeah, so the conditions in these facilities are they vary depending on what time of year it is, for example. They vary depending on like the weather conditions. I say that because like Robert Lumpkins, for example, is in a creek bottom, and so when it floods, the it gets very bad indeed, very buggy, lots of mosquitoes, and as a result, lots of disease, for example.
Yep.
It varies a bit. Some are in cities, some are in small towns, but generally speaking, the conditions are pretty bad. As you can imagine. But they're sort of tempered by the fact that slave traders' business is transacting in people, and so their goal is to keep enslaved people alive and show them off to the best advantage possible. And so, while the conditions within the jail themselves are obviously brutal, you also have and this gets to the primary source question, right? One of the ways we know about, so we know this sort of from two directions. One is the narratives that we have from people who were confined in these facilities. So Anthony Burns, for example, who was famously extradited from Boston
Yep.
with massive federal assistance in the mid 1850s, he left us a description of Robert Lumpkin's jail where he talks about the poor sleeping conditions, about the vermin that sort of infested the walls and things like that. That's absolutely true. The other vehicle we have for seeing them, though, is we have the accounts of a number of slave traders, like literally their sort of personal ledger books. And so what you see in there, for example, is the amount that they're paying over for food. To feed the people held in these jails, we can get a sense for what they ate. Generally speaking, it's food that is designed to give them a quick calorie boost, so that people look healthy when they're up for
Mhm.
sale. Um, you have the clothing. Slave traders purchase generally sort of specific clothing designed to show enslaved people off to advantage and make them look healthy and therefore worth more money. Shoes, things like that, as well as medical care. Again, one of the goals is to keep people alive at least as long as is required to sell them or to survive the journey that they would undertake south. And so it's a real balancing act where slave traders are trying to keep costs at a minimum. They have to pay. It cuts into their profits to keep people in their jail for a long time. But on the other hand, they want to show them off advantageously when they eventually sell them.
Wow, incredible. So, in terms of the social stratification within Southern society, I kind of have like a three-part question. It's a before, during, and after question because I
Mhm.
believe that these views change over time. How did the planter elite view slave traders prior to the war, during the war, and after the war?
Mm. Well, I can't say that it necessarily change. Actually, I'm not sure this is something that changes all that much.
Okay.
Because what you see is that before the Civil War, the Southern elite, whether that's sort of the economic elite or the the literati, the people who are writing defenses of the South as a slaveholding society, they realize that the internal slave trade practice within the United States is a major weak point.
Mm.
This is if you're making the argument as they did that slavery is a good institution and that it is good and beneficial to people of African descent, then the purchase, sale, removal, and all of the suffering and death that comes with that is a pretty glaring vulnerability in your in the defenses of the institution. And so what elite white Southerners largely do in the pre-war years is they either ignore or downplay the scope
Mm.
and scale of the slave trade. They say, yeah, this happens, but it doesn't happen as much as you think it does. It doesn't happen all that often. Most of the people who engage in it really don't want to. It's out of necessity, for example, or they blame it. They essentially shift the blame onto this sort of nebulous class of professional slave traders themselves. They say this is
Mm.
really the slave traders' fault. The abuses, the evils that go on in this. That's really on the slave traders who, and this is one of those, one of those things that is sort of shot through with irony. They basically say, actually, the slave traders are functionally Yankees. They are
Right.
avaristic. They are focused on making money, and that's at odds with the culture of the plantation South. Now, is that true? Not really. Um,
Right.
what one of the things that's interesting is so they project on sort of this nebulous class of slave traders. What this ignores is that pretty much anybody, basically, you can get away with. There's this sense, and slaveholding Southerners say this all the time before the Civil War, that slaveholders are reviled within Southern society, and
Mm.
the sense that I have is that that's kind of true if a slaveholder doesn't have a lot of money, or a slave trader rather doesn't make a lot of money.
Right.
On the other
Right.
hand, you have, but if you make enough money, you can do pretty much whatever you want. So, for example, one of the leading slave traders in Richmond is on the board of the most prominent railroad in Virginia. He is on the city council for much of the Civil War era. And is heavily active in the city's politics, for example. So if you have enough money, essentially, that you can if you have enough money, the slaveholding South is willing to ignore this even sort of at the highest levels. One I didn't put this in the book because I couldn't quite find a place for it, but there was a Missouri judge had a diary that he kept throughout most of this period. And one entry that stood out to me is like after the Civil War, he goes to a play with his daughter, and the play features sort of this stock slave trader character. And as he's leaving the play, he hears people talking, and a younger person essentially saying, "Well, is this true? Like, were slave traders, hated like this?" And another audience member says, "No, of course not. Nobody hates people with that much money." Um,
Oh,
and
wow.
so that's kind of that's a very long way of saying that before, during, and after the war, white Southerners kind of deflect blame for the slave trade onto slave traders. Um, but in reality, they're deeply enmeshed within the political and social culture of the antebellum South.
Wow. Wow. That's wow, amazing. One of the historiographical interventions you make that I think that not enough people think about is the presence of the enslaved in cities, right, as opposed to
Mhm.
the plantation stereotype. So how did the continuation of the slave trade shape the social and economic fabric of certain southern cities during the war?
Mhm.
And were there
Yeah.
any cities where the trade completely altered a city's trajectory or identity?
Well, so I wouldn't say necessarily altered, but what altered their trajectory or identity. But what I will say is that the slave trade fits really well with the changes that take place in many southern cities during the war. So slave trading, as we think about it, and by that we mean sort of the large scale and highly professional slave trade, is kind of an urban phenomenon, right? The biggest slave trading centers are cities like Richmond, Charleston, New Orleans being the biggest, Natchez in Mississippi. Even though the slave trade, right, the purchase, sale, and movement of enslaved people takes place everywhere, virtually any county courthouse in the slaveholding South sees slave transactions probably on a monthly basis. And But what we see during the Civil War, I would say, is that a lot of the cities within the Confederacy grow enormously. They're swollen. Richmond's population, for example, more than doubles during the Civil War. But through a combination of sort of people coming to work in war industries, the growing bureaucracy of the city, and refugees from parts of the Confederacy that the Union Army had occupied. And so what that means is that there's a greater demand for labor, and slave traders help and the slave trade helps fill that demand for labor in,
Interesting.
for example, like the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond. The
Yep.
Tredegar Iron Works by almost 20 people that I can document during the war. I would guess probably more. But also, it just means that you have sort of more people with more needs congregated in a small space. And so there's a lot of sort of back and forth. So the slave trade, I would say, and this is true both of cities. But one of the things that I found in researching the slave trade during the Civil War is that it adapts.
Mm.
And that one of the things I think that suggests is we have a very sort of static view of slavery as practiced in the United States. We think of it as limited to agriculture. We think of it as sort of uniquely tied to the production of a few commodities. Slavery was an incredibly flexible institution. And I think the way that the slave trade adapts to some of the urbanization that happens during the Civil War reflects that.
Right. So, in terms of resistance during the war, how did
Mhm.
enslaved people resist being trafficked? And can you share any stories of individual, or collective resistance that had a broader impact on the war?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of one particular example. And the short answer is that resistance to the slave trade is part of this sort of larger dance that's happening during the war about emancipation, right? And I think we'll talk about this as we move towards sort of general orders number three. But I think we often have a view of emancipation that it's something that just happens.
Hmm.
That Congress passes the Confiscation Acts, that Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and therefore there is emancipation. And that is absolutely not how it plays out on the ground. One of the things that really struck me as I was researching this book is that in the fall of 1862, when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the things that a lot of Confederate periodicals do is they essentially say, well, gee, Lincoln issued this Emancipation Proclamation, but just the other day we had a transaction in enslaved people in which X number of people went for Y number of dollars. Nobody would do that if they thought this proclamation meant anything. So clearly, white Southerners aren't scared of the
Hmm.
proclamation. The proclamation only takes effect. Emancipation only happens where either African Americans can make their escape, or where Union military power makes it possible for them to sustain their freedom. Right. Um, so. And the slave trade helps Confederates fight against this by allowing them to move people from areas where emancipation is an actual risk. Northern Virginia, the coasts of North and South Carolina, lower Louisiana, things like that. The slave trade allows slaveholders in those regions to move and to sell people away from freedom in those places. So it's a weapon that slaveholders use against emancipation. But
Right.
um, it's a really delicate balance, and it's something they have to weigh, because one thing that does happen is if enslaved people think there's even a chance they will be sold, they're highly likely to flee.
Mhm.
People who might not otherwise be inclined to take all the risks associated with flight. Well, if they find they're going to be sold anyway, they essentially might as well. So one example that I think of, and this is something I'm working on as part of a new project. The man named William Andrew Jackson, who was enslaved in Richmond, Virginia. He claimed during and after the Civil War that he had been the personal, like, rented coachman to Jefferson Davis. Um,
Mm.
well, in the spring of 1862, the man who enslaved him died. And the way Jackson tells it, he learned that he was going to be sold, that the executors of this man's estate were going to sell him, as sort of the fallout from this enslaver's death. And so he records that he and his wife, who was not owned by the same person, stayed up late at night talking about, well, what should we do? How do we respond to this? And ultimately, they decided that the best answer was for him to flee. And so he was at least somewhat literate. He forged a pass that would get him through Confederate lines. He made his way to Union lines near Fredericksburg, Virginia, and he made good his escape. And then spent the rest of the war
Uh,
telling people about this. So, in the sense that I would say, in the sense that, like, that sort of resistance, right? Speakers like Jackson made compelling cases for emancipation, made compelling cases for Black equality after the Emancipation Proclamation, and so in some ways, you certainly could argue that resistance to the slave trade um, has a serious impact on how Americans think about the war.
Wow. So before we get to discussing Juneteenth, I have just one final question. You note that many of the traders that you studied during the course of your research have been largely forgotten.
Mhm.
Why have these men vanished from historical memory? And did any of them reinvent themselves after the war? And what happened to the majority of them after the war anyway?
Yeah, so what happens to them after the war is I've tried to trace this, and it's pretty elusive. Uh, a lot of the men who are most one of the things I'll just say, one of the challenges that I found in writing this book is that a lot of them died during the war. At least a lot of the most prominent, a surprising number of the most prominent former slave traders died during the war. Which means that their records either disappear or are incomplete, or so forth and so on. Some achieved sort of a national prominence. Nathan Bedford Forrest is probably the most famous slave trader who comes out of the Civil War. He had actually retired about a year before the Civil War began. To your point, right? He retires to
Oh,
his
wow.
plantations in Mississippi.
Huh.
But he sort of stands in some ways in the public mind for slave traders after the war. Most either sort of retire to properties that they had held. In other parts of the South, or they just reinvent themselves as sort of ordinary businessmen.
Right.
One of the a guy who is sort of a quiet member of one of the more of the largest slave trading firm in Richmond, for example. He, after the Civil War, he owns proper rental properties in Richmond. He owns sort of a set of stables in Richmond. He's president of a bank. One of the things that certainly there are a handful of slave traders who are just broke, who have nothing left at the end of the war. And I can tell you, at least two Virginia slave traders commit suicide at the end of the war because
Mhm,
they
mhm.
have sort of nothing left. But others, one of the things that a lot of the new work on the slave trade shows us is that the slave trade is deeply enmeshed into sort of the wider world of, or the wider commercial communities of the cities where these slave traders lived, and so a lot of them are able to draw on those connections to run other businesses. They become dry goods merchants. They manage properties. They are involved in banks, things like this, and so many of them just sort of fade quietly into the background, and
Hmm.
are sort of lost, right? I think a lot of the slave trade is forgotten also because a lot of there are relatively few sort of designated slave trading sites that survive. They were not always in the most sort of prominent areas of cities. A lot of them have been sort of paved over, quite literally. And so, unlike, for example, like battlefields, or unlike sort of plantation houses that survive and have sort of an appeal of some sort that keeps people visiting them, that keeps people commemorating them. This was something a lot of Americans wanted to forget. And as sort of the urban histories of slave trading centers evolved, they were easy to forget. So, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. And so to shift gears a little bit here, we're celebrating the 160th anniversary of Juneteenth tomorrow, which commemorates the day when Union General Gordon Granger issued General Order Number 3 in Galveston, Texas, which announced the freedom of enslaved people. Before I read the text, because it's a short text of the General Order, can you just give us a sense and maybe set the scene a little bit? What's happening in the United States between April, the end
Mhm.
of hostilities in most areas and the death of Lincoln, and June, right? So you get this
Mhm.
2-month period. What are the enslaved experiencing in the South?
Mm.
What are Union armies doing? Are the Confederates still in the field? What's happening in June 1865?
Yeah, so a number of things are happening between. So I think we often sort of date the end of the Civil War to the surrender of Robert E. Lee's army at Appomattox in April. But it takes a number of weeks for the remain. Lee does not surrender all of the Confederate troops. He only surrenders his own Army of Northern Virginia, and so it takes another several weeks in the intervening period, which of course Lincoln is assassinated. And The Confederate government is on the run well into May. Union forces are moving throughout parts of the Confederacy that they had not yet penetrated. And Union officers are taking the surrender of the remaining Confederate armies in the field. Joseph Johnston surrenders a large number of Confederates at Durham, North Carolina. Edmund Kirby Smith, who had been the Trans-Mississippi West commander, surrenders his forces some weeks later. And so there is this period. There is this period of turmoil.
Mm,
The political, right, with the death of Lincoln. And one of the things I think we also forget, right, is that the Civil War ends without a clear plan in place for what's going to happen after the Civil War. There's some things, the 13th Amendment has been passed by Congress but not ratified. There's no clear template for what's going to be required for former Confederate states to re-enter the Union. It's unclear what their legal status is to begin with. And so it's a period of incredible turmoil. Enslaved. What the other thing? I'll just note this to your point. We think about and we rightly celebrate the Civil War as this moment where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people free themselves during the Civil War. We don't have perfect numbers, but the general estimate is that between 400 and 500,000 enslaved people liberate themselves. They flee to Union forces. They follow Union armies. They liberate themselves during the war. Um, that number may be as high as 800,000. But even if we take that highest number, right, that means that fewer than 1 in 5 of the people enslaved in the United States was actually free. And we probably could have a much larger conversation about what it means to be free. But
right.
when the war ends, only about 1 in every 5 people has actually sort of liberated themselves from a state of slavery. That means that 80% of, at least, maybe closer to 90% of the people enslaved in the former Confederacy have not experienced any sort of, well, have experienced changes, right? The society
Mhm.
of the South changes enormously during the war, but are not formally free. And I'll just say, like, if you read in the WPA narratives, these interviews of formerly enslaved people done in the 1930s, one of the things that you see regularly in them is they talk about someone, either Union forces showing up on the property on which they were held, or former Confederates coming home and essentially saying the war is over and you are no longer enslaved. Um, what exactly that means is pretty nebulous. But so essentially what you have is this sort of slow unfolding of the end of the war and the end of slavery, but with a lot of ambiguity about what exactly that means.
Right. Right. And to your point, if we look at the direct quotation from the source, the General Order number 3, which is in the chat, but I'll read it. The people are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them become that between employer and hired labor. The freed are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. So there's a couple of really interesting points. One, this is coming from a military officer, right? Somebody from the military, not necessarily an elected official. And this translates into the first celebrations of Juneteenth. So how do we get this sort of militarized, not militarized, but this martial language and this sort of free labor language to a celebration of liberation and emancipation that is the holiday that Juneteenth becomes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long story, and one that has sort of evolved across the 150 years. What I would say just one thing that stands out to me, right, is that you're right, and you just read this language, which is absolutely loaded with ideas about what freedom actually means, in the minds of General Jordan Granger or Gordon Granger, excuse me. Talking about equality of personal rights and rights of property. Well, what does that mean? That's something that's going to be hashed out over the next decade and then hashed out again. And then this question of working for wages. Where are freed people supposed to go? Well, he wants them to remain where they are. So what you have here is essentially a tension, right? A tension that is going to is really going to play out in the post-war South over, well, you could say the next year, you could say the next 5 years, you could say the next 100 years,
Mm,
about what does freedom actually mean. Um, and there's a lot of back and forth about economic rights, about personal rights, about political rights, right? There are gains and losses. African Americans make major gains during Reconstruction, only to see those lost during Jim Crow. But what I think is telling at some level, right, is that for all of the sort of hemming and hawing that I think we read into this, one thing that it does tell us is that that enslaved people celebrate this because whatever did or did not change, slavery was over. They understood slavery to be over. And this was something I wrestled with in writing my book, because we know that there is a lot that doesn't change.
mm,
The economic condition of enslaved people does not change enormously following emancipation, for example. We know how hard they have to fight for rights. But and so, kind of coming down on a question of, okay, so is there more continuity, or is there more dissimilarity? I think it is worth remembering. I think it's very telling that they are celebrating this moment as something different happening. The
hmm
freedom that emerges out of the war is absolutely incomplete. It is absolutely contested, but it is different from what came before. Slavery, the celebration of Juneteenth tells us, is dead, right? And Juneteenth is not the only example of this. Juneteenth for a long time was primarily a Texas holiday, right? Because
Yep.
this is a proclamation taking place in Texas. But formerly enslaved people celebrated versions of this all throughout the American South. In some places they celebrated January 1st as Emancipation Day, right? Celebrating the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. In Virginia, the Black community celebrated Appomattox Day, sort of the end of military hostilities, and the defeat of the Confederacy, and recognized that as sort of the formal end to slavery. And so, the fact that these are holidays that are celebrated tells us that, for all the incompleteness of that freedom, that something is happening here.
Right. That something changed. So Juneteenth's evolved, right, as you said, from a holiday that really was localized in Texas to now a national holiday that's recognized across the United States. And so as a historian who studies how slavery endured even during the Civil War, how do you see the meaning of Juneteenth changing over time?
Well, I think it's certainly changed. I think most notably from being, I think, predominantly an African American holiday to being a national holiday, and I think that there has been a lot of discourse about June. I mean, when Juneteenth first became a federal holiday, there was there was a lot of pushback in
Hmm.
certain circles, right? And I don't know. I mean, to me, I think it's telling, and I think it's good that we celebrate. The military removal, and foreshadowing the political removal of sort of the greatest stain on the American past.
Mm.
I think celebrating Juneteenth, especially as it comes in such close proximity to the 4th of July, right? I think there's something valuable to remembering the ills of the American past as part of a celebration of what of the American ideals, right? I think it reminds me, having those two in close conjunction reminds me of Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the Fourth of July" speech, where he talks, in fact, about a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. He highlights the slave trade as one of the many present ills of the United States in the 1850s. I was rereading it the other day, and he says, the slave trade is big business at the moment that he's talking. It's resurging following a depression in the 1840s. And yet, well, the where Douglas ends with that speech, it starts so dark. It starts, with his exclusion, but he essentially says repeatedly, so it doesn't have to be this way, right? And in some ways, I think celebrating Juneteenth is celebrating that, Americans eventually decided it is not that way, right? And marking that, I think is powerful.
Right, right. Yeah. Wow. So I want to say thank you. I have one more question, but we've got a couple of audience questions here. The first one's lengthy, and this is fascinating. Let me just put it in the chat so that I don't bungle it. Uh, so the question from Ken Masugi: David Hackett Fisher's African founders opened up the tribal character of enslaved people. Perhaps more in the northern colonies, purchasers of slaves would bid for slaves from one area of Africa over others. Does your research on the traders promote Fisher's work on purchases of enslaved people from one region of Africa versus other regions?
So mine does not particularly, and the reason for that is because by the period I study, almost all of the people bought and sold in the domestic slave trade African American in the literal sense of the word. That they and many of their ancestors had been born in the United States, and so while there certainly are still people being smuggled into the United States from Africa, we don't have good numbers, but maybe the estimate you often see is about 50,000 people smuggled into the United States. The 800,000 people that white Southerners moved through the domestic slave trade are overwhelmingly African American. There are other characteristics that purchasers and sellers value, whether that is whether that's age, whether that's gender, whether that's skills enslaved people are perceived to possess. But I've not seen anything that sort of at this point that speaks to that.
Right. So maybe in the early republic around the founding era,
Hmm.
people being imported were chosen from specific regions. Yes. Okay. As opposed to later, your unit of study, the international slave trade, for all intents and purposes, had been closed, right?
Yeah,
Especially the
or
British.
is driven largely underground. It makes sort of a white Southerners make sort of flamboyant efforts to revive it
Yeah.
in the 1850s. And there is a late surge in the importation of people from Africa right before the congressional ban can go into effect in
Hmm.
1808.
Hmm.
But for the most part, the people who the African Americans enslaved in the United States in 1860 are overwhelmingly the descendants of people who have been in the United States for multiple generations.
Right. Right. Another question. So, did Juneteenth historically have a religious element? In my limited research, I was struck by references to church services and picnics.
Mm. I mean, it's one of those things where, at some level, like religion is so pervasive in the 19th century that almost everything has a religious element. That is to say that, whether it's sponsored by a religious entity or an entity with religious ties, whether it's held in a religious space, um, I, to my knowledge, there are not sort of explicit connections um, between religious entities and Juneteenth. Though I will say, David Blight has a great book that talks about the Civil War as this moment of jubilee.
Mm,
That enslaved people and enslaved Christians understood the Civil War as, and this is a concept that comes out of sort of the Christian tradition, or goes all the way back to the biblical tradition, right? That every so often there was this year of jubilee where things changed, where burdens were lifted. And, there are certainly many enslaved people who see the Civil War and who see emancipation as this moment of jubilee. And so it is infused, right? It is infused with this sort of the sort of Christianity, right, that pervades the culture of the 19th century. But is it predominantly a religious holiday? I would say probably not. Is it you know except to the same degree that so much of the African American experience post-war is bound up in the Black church.
mm, right. And so, sort of going back to your work, was there at any point in your research, did you find slave traders? I mean, how did slave traders justify their actions? And was it an economic rationale? Did they even feel like they had to justify it because everybody was doing it? Was it a moral
Mhm.
or a religious justification? Was it a legal justification? Were there ever sort of, called out during
Oh,
that time?
yeah. I mean, so I would say I found relatively few moments where slave traders themselves are justifying their business. The sort of to the degree that they do, they largely engage in the same array of defenses that white Southerners aligned around the institution of slavery, which took an enormous number of forms. Everything from pointing out that the northern states had until a few decades earlier been slaveholders themselves. That most of the slaves who had arrived in the United States came on New England ships, right? These are
Mm,
widely printed in the Southern press.
yeah.
To the pros to ideas that slavery is good for American democracy, right? John C. Calhoun's famous "Slavery: A Positive Good" speech argues that slavery is part of a natural social order, to the religious defenses of slavery as an institution ordained by the Bible, right? There is an incredible array of defense. There are rather an incredible array of defenses built up around the institution of slavery by white Southerners in the 19th century. I don't know that slave traders espouse any that are any different.
Right.
But they're part of a culture that has developed a really intricate array of ways of defending their actions.
And could you maybe speak a little bit more about the relationship, if any, between slave traders that you studied and perhaps allies in the North?
Can you say a
What
little
I
more about that?
what I mean is that to what extent were slave traders in contact with Northerners other than perhaps abolitionist greed? Did they have I mean, who's investing in them outside of the South?
Well, so they have financial connections,
Right.
though it's hard to say exactly how those functions because our evidence is somewhat limited. Certainly in like the antebellum period, for example, Joshua Rothman and Sharon Ann Murphy have pointed out that like slave trading firms, one slave trading firm in particular, an outfit called Franklin and Armfield, tapped
Hmm.
into enormous amount of resources from the Second Bank of the United States, just as an
Wow.
example, right?
Right.
So there are enormous financial ties, and one of the things that you see in slave like in going through a slave trader's account book is because currency is such a mess in the 19th century, right? Uh, but you can see all different sorts of banknotes, all different sorts of money running through their businesses. So there certainly are financial ties. This is a much larger conversation, right? But one of the things that stands out about studying slave traders is a huge number of them have families with enslaved women. They have children with women whom they enslaved, and many of their families end up in the North either before or during the war. So
Oh,
does that and the circumstances are a little murky. Why exactly or how are there personal connections? It's hard to say. But up until certain points, slaveholding Southerners generally have pretty extensive social connections with North South Carolinians. Famously, vacation at like Newport, Rhode Island,
yeah,
for
oh, right,
example.
right, right,
And so that I see no, I don't have a lot of specific evidence, but I don't know why slave traders would be all that different.
right. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. So my final question before we wrap things up here. First of all, I just want to say thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. Thank you to our audience members and the JMC communications team, especially our web guru and manager of communications, Anna Zematitis. So before I close this, the question I have is the big one, right? What has your research taught you about America's founding principles and history?
Yeah, I think I would say kind of two things. One is that I think I've really learned a lot from reading reading the historical debates over sort of the nature of the Constitution, right?
Mhm.
There's been really interesting work going back and forth on whether the Constitution is pro-slavery, anti-slavery, and so forth. Um, and at a minimum, what my research has suggested is right, those debates matter. Um,
Mhm.
how Americans interpret their constitutional principles, how they interpret their founding, has profound implications for the society that they choose to live in. And so that's sort of the nebulous one. The more practical one is something that we've been talking about a lot today. Is that the Civil War and the destruction of slavery, I think, reflect in some ways the possibilities of America's founding principles. The degree to which Lincoln pursues them during the war, for example, is rooted so heavily in his view of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is views shared by so many people, and endorsed. One of the things that struck me in doing this research is that many African Americans during the Civil War have extremely high hopes for and opinions of Abraham Lincoln.
Mhm.
Um, I found multiple people who were either jailed or sold because they said good things about Abraham Lincoln.
Huh.
And what I and I this is a roundabout way of getting to the idea of like the principles really matter, but it came at an extraordinary cost to
Mhm.
implement them. We could talk about Lincoln's second inaugural address where he talks about every drop of blood being that was drawn forth being by the lash being paid for by blood drawn forth by the sword. But we could also just I think thinking about the ways people resisted the slave trade, that it took resistance, that it took people
Mhm.
choosing to fight back against the institution of slavery to truly destroy it. And those two things work in tandem with each other. So yeah, that's I think that's something that really jumped out to me as I was doing this research.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. So, thank you, Robert. Really appreciate you taking the time again to meet with us. If the audience members like this webinar, you want to learn more about the JMC and how we support the teaching of America's founding principles and history, we encourage you to go to our website and sign up for our email list. And a special thanks, of course, to the donors at the Jack Miller Center who make these programs possible. To support our work, just go to jackmillercenter.org. And to support the work of this all-star scholar, go to Amazon or go to the book vendor of your choice. It's a great book, and we really appreciate your time, Robert. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed talking to you this afternoon.
Excellent. All right. Have a great day. Thank you, everybody.